What follows is a brief construction montage.
Late again.
Limited time only.
Flashback.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up.
End of flashback. Soon after. Montage.
Previously, yesterday, meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, back in the Lola.
Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the seven seas.
A few moments later.
Moments later.
Moments later.
Moments later. More moments later.
A little later. 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 Later.
Later. Later.
Later. Later.
Later.
Later. Later. In the void. Later that same evening.
Later that day. Later that night.
Later that night.
Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later.
Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The following Thursday,
You get the idea.
just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m., 8:01 p.m., 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later,
1 minute later.
1 minute 37 seconds later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later,
A few minutes later,
a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later,
Many minutes later.
1 hour later, 1 hour later,
1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later.
1 hour later,
1 hour later.
2 hours later, 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 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later,
3 hours later.
3 hours later, 5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later,
9 hours later.
approximately 10 hours later, several song-filled hours later, many hours later,
Many hours of fun time later.
Many chilly hours later. Many unbearable hours later.
tomorrow for sure. 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning, 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 the next morning,
The next morning.
the next,
The next morning.
the next day, the next day,
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day.
the following day, tomorrow,
The very next evening.
The next evening.
day 2, 48 hours later, 2 days later, day 3, 72 hours later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, day 4,
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later.
several days later,
Several days later.
1 week later, 1 week later,
1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 3 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 6 months later, 6 months later,
6 months later!
several months later, many months later,
70 years later.
75 years later, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later,
5 million years later.
One eternity later. Opening night. A lot of boring math later.
Many tic-tacs later.
Many secret parties later.
One semester later.
One season later.
8 semesters later.
One debt to society later.
One very long digestive tract later.
One little boost to the surface later. One pathetic sob story later. One frozen wasteland later. One long angry line later. One shift later.
One shift later.
One extremely annoying shift later. One wiener later.
One nap later.
One operation later.
One pair of pants later.
1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later.
2 idiots later.
82 kilometers later.
298 frozen patties later. Thousands of tears later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later. Eventually. Several bad puns later.
Graduation day.
Epilogue.
Epilogue.
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.